been over by the wall, or it could have been a million light years away. It didn't matter. I was suddenly looking out through the eyes of another member of his race, perceiving whatever that individual's environment looked like. And he said, okay, Bruce, now sweep your eyes downward. And so I did, and realized, oh, I'm looking out through the eyes of a different member of his race. And I appear to be on the ground in a house. I wonder if that's a wife. Listen. And I hear, Bruce, you're thinking in human terms. Oh yeah, okay. Because I was beginning to think of, oh, I wonder if I'm on their home planet. I wonder if I'm in one of their homes. I wonder if I can deduce anything about what I'm seeing in terms of their family structures. I was thinking in human terms, and the spokesman caught me and just said, Bruce, remember what you agreed to? And I said, oh yeah, okay. And he said, Bruce, shift your eyes to the left. And I did, and realized, oh, now I'm looking out through the eyes of another body, another member of their race. And it didn't matter if that person was where the podium is or millions of light years over. I was looking out through that one's eyes. I was perceiving whatever that one was perceiving. And he could have been standing at McDonald's if they like to eat there. And I would have been seeing that through the eyes of another member of their race. Seeing through the eyes of another member, it's the closest I can get at this point to describing to you what telepathic means to me now. It's not the same as I understood it before. You could think of it more like sharing bodies instead of sharing minds. I'm not sure how you think about it, but it's not the same as I thought of it before. And after realizing I was looking out the eyes of one way over there, I suddenly realized I was back. And I could, oh, that's my mother again, and there's my grandmother again. And I said, what are they doing here? The spokesman said, oh, he said, they just came along as helpers. He said, you know, when you were within our consciousness, if you had begun to think in human terms and continued to think in human terms, you would have been restructuring our reality into human terms, which are very alien to us. And if it progressed too far, our entire consciousness could have been trapped within some human construct that's so alien to us, we'd all blacked out and gone unconscious. So your mother and your grandmother here were that in case that happened, they were supposed to come over and say, Bruce, remember what you were doing. Remember what you agreed not to do. Let them go. Fortunately, they didn't have to do that. So I learned a little bit about telepathic. And in context, I learned a little bit about human. I mean, our chosen route of conscious evolution seems to be, I'm not sure if it's absolutely unique, but all the other alien races I've met out there, as opposed to here, all the ones I've met are telepathic. We seem to be different. We seem to have chosen an evolutionary route through consciousness that we see ourselves as individuals, and we view things from our own perspective. We don't view things from the perspective of all of everyone else in our race. There's something different about us. There's something unique about us. In my next experience with the second gather group guys, the spokesman said, you know, Bruce, he said, we understand that you were somewhat concerned about our first encounter and some of the things that might have happened to us, and you know, we've talked about that before. And I said, yeah, I understand. I understand I didn't do any real damage. He said, yeah. He said, yeah, you understand that in the space of a year, our entire race graduated from the human school of learning. And I understood that, yeah. I understood that somehow their entire race had learned to experience and express unconditional love to such a high degree that once they learned that lesson, and it took less than a year for their entire race, once they learned that lesson, every act they committed is an act of pure unconditional love. He said, Bruce, I want to tell you what's happened recently, some of the latest developments. I said, good, I can write about it in my next book. He said, yeah, go ahead. He said, now in human terms, Bruce, he said, the way I would describe this is that we filled up spaceships with members of our race, and we sent those spaceships off to the home worlds of other races who are telepathic like us. So we did that with the intent of teaching them what this unconditional love stuff was. He said we taught them in the same way that you taught us. He said we let them know we were there, and we let them know that we had this information on the earth changes and what it was really about. And we offered to share this knowledge with them, and they agreed to take it. And so we did the same thing. We brought in 2 members of their race, a male and a female, since that's how you guys demonstrated it to us. We stepped into their bodies, and we experienced unconditional love, and that sort of spread it out through their entire race. In kind of very short period of time, every member of their race had experienced unconditional love, and it wasn't long before the first home world that we taught them that, they had learned the lesson and graduated from Earth School too. Every act they committed was an act of unconditional love. He said, we had done this lots of places, he said. So then we started getting these really strange reports back. He said, one of the groups we had gone to teach sent back this report that something very strange had happened, that one day they suddenly realized that they were able to look out through the eyes of another telepathic race living on another home world somewhere else. And that race, another one that had been visited by a second Gath group, reported the same thing. This very odd thing has happened to us. This was unexpected. We suddenly find ourselves not only looking out through the eyes of our own race, but we're able to look out through the eyes of this other race too. The spokesman said, we didn't understand what was going on. We just thought this was some really strange thing, some really anomalous thing. He said, a third planet we had visited began to report similar experience. That they had suddenly one day discovered they could now see out the eyes of a completely different telepathic race and another one over here. And the other 2 reported the same thing. But somehow all members of these 3 telepathic races were now able to see out of the eyes of, and that's my best description of what telepathic really means, of 2 other races. He said, Bruce, we still didn't understand what was going on until it happened to us. He said, when it happened to us, we understood. He said, Bruce, you could think of the planet, and you could think of the telepathic race living on it, and you could think of it like when we taught them what unconditional love energy was. As they began to experience that unconditional love energy, you could kind of think of it as a spherical wave front of that energy expanding outward from their planet into the space around them. Well, he said we had done that with a planet over here, and we had done that with a planet way over there, and he said at some point those 2 wave fronts passed each other. The unconditional love energy from each place joined. It was when that happened that they began to be able to see out of the eyes of the other member's race, or the other race's members. And when the 3rd group reported the same thing, what had happened, as a way to visualize it, the unconditional love energy that race had learned to experience and express, expanding outward in this sort of spherical ball of energy, had contacted the other 2. He said, Bruce, we now understand more about what the earth changes really mean. So we understand it from our own perspective as one in which we would describe that all of these various telepathic races are remembering. They're not remembering it like it's coming back to mind. That's remembering. those races are beginning to join into an entirely new form of consciousness. They're joining into consciousness at a level far beyond the capabilities of any one of them, into a new being with all of the information, all of the understanding of all those members of all those races joined into one being. I wish I could jump up and scream, because it just excites the hell out of me to think about that. Then he said, now Bruce, like I said before, we now understand a little more about what your earth changes are about. He said, the way I would describe it is that as your planet moves further and further into that beam of unconditional love energy that is the earth changes, and that as that unconditional love energy comes into your reality, and as members of the human race, physical and non-physical, and whatever kind of way of being we can be, as human beings begin to allow that energy to be experienced and expressed through them, as we as human beings learn to experience and express unconditional love energy to a greater and greater degree, he said, what's happening for humans is you folks are in sort of a smaller version of the same thing that's happening to us. So you could think of it as a birth. You could think of it as a birth of a new form of consciousness, a new form of human consciousness, which appears to be somewhat unique. A form of consciousness in which all these lines I've been putting through between all these areas of human consciousness, all those lines get erased. And awareness as a human being is no longer confined to one small little area of reality, one small little area of consciousness. No longer are we living here in the physical world, living in a human consciousness in which we've compartmentalized ourselves into C1 physical world, and Focus 22, the Nut Squad, and Focus 23, the folks who are dead and don't know it, and Focus 24, 25, the belief system territories. So all those boundaries disappear. So that's what the earth changes is about. And as human beings learn to express and experience unconditional love to a greater and greater degree, it automatically opens your awareness beyond the normal limits, and you begin to be able to communicate directly with people who've died. I mean, has anybody noticed that there seem to be a lot more people nowadays having a lot more experiences that 25 years ago you would have said they were crazy? And you yourselves look at those experiences and don't necessarily think of them as crazy anymore? Have you noticed that? Have you noticed that in my country, the statistics on major violent crime for the last 9 years have been trending downward? You know, we still get all the news stories about the crazy things that happen, but when you look at the overall statistics, murders and rapes and violent robberies and the violent crime in the U.S. and the major cities is trending downward and has been for a number of years. Wonder why? I used to wonder why, but I've decided that as a race, as a species, as a form of consciousness, we human beings undertook a task. We undertook a purpose way back. And the purpose we undertook was to bring unconditional love energy from somewhere else into this level of reality, with the intent that it would serve to open awareness beyond its normal limits. I'm not sure that we humans had the slightest inkling that our human race wouldn't be the only one to benefit. But in my experience, that's true. in my experience, other races of beings that most people will claim don't exist, other races of beings who are circling the earth out in a place where you can't see them with a naked eye very often, I guess, who came to study, to understand. They've already graduated from the school we built. They've already learned the power of pure unconditional love. And it has spread way beyond the boundaries of this little physical earth we live on already. And it continues to spread. And the message I got from these second gather group guys was, hey, Bruce, go back and tell the human folks that we're with you. We'll continue to beam as much of that energy as we possibly can into your reality just to give you more boost so you guys can fulfill your purpose. Well, that's what I see as the purpose of humankind. I think we're doing a pretty decent job. And every one of us, every day, every minute, every second, every time any one of us experiences unconditional love or expresses unconditional love and learns to do it just a little bit more, we're moving toward this place I call the land of angels. We're learning toward mentoring others. We're headed toward graduation. We have, well, for those of you who have to leave at 9:30, we have about 15 minutes in which I could listen to questions and try to respond to them. And for those of you who want to stick around later, I think we can stick around till about 10 before they turn the lights out on us and send us out of here. So, is there anyone here who has a question? I think I put them all to sleep, Duncan. Oh, wait, nope. Sure.
When you mentioned that incident about that little boy not being very well, and the mother was praying, and somehow something with one of the angels gave boost and help. One of the dilemmas that we have as human beings is why some people do survive and why do some die. Like, if a person who you love and care and you prayed for their survival, why did they die? Is it that because that's their lesson?
I could try to answer your question on a couple different levels. The first one I would answer it on is, well, I know from my experience, before I came to live in this body during this time, I probably sat down and chatted with some friends of mine and said, hey, when I go in this time, how about if you and I meet up? How you and I agree to do this and this and this? I know that from my own experience that I've made choices that lead to my experience in this lifetime. So on one level, I could say, in answer to your question, those people made some choices to have that within their experience. But at a more basic level, I guess I would say you can learn to experience and express unconditional love both by having more of it or having less of it. That having a loved one die may have some lessons about experiencing and expressing unconditional love.
And letting go.
Yeah, whatever that lesson is for us, yeah.
It seems that part of the whole big thing, to me, is not only learning unconditional love, but it's really, really having, you're saying that we're fairly unique, is having the experience of things like grief, like emotion. So that we may be enlightened others.
Yeah, it may be that Yeah, it may be that that taking on this purpose of bringing unconditional love energy in and spreading it required that we would be willing to experience a wide range of emotional energies.
To come to that final love point.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you had seen a force against this unconditional love, whether there is a force on the earth that does not want humanity to go through this unconditional love or experience this unconditional love. And also, if humanity does not live and learn, do you think that the earth will change accordingly?
Okay, let me try to repeat those two questions. The first one was, have I met with any forces that wouldn't want this unconditional love energy to succeed? That was the first one. And the second one was, if we don't manage to do it, will there be some changes? And I saw a lot of shaking going on.
Will we be presented with other lessons that may force us? I mean, will the earth go through, say, structural changes or something?
Will the earth go through structural changes and that sort of thing? Well, let's see if I can remember the first question. I've never encountered anything to be afraid of in my explorations that I can remember, at least since I started doing it actively. But I have encountered, and I've certainly talked to others who have encountered things that appeared to be negative energies, things that appeared to be fighting against you, if you will. But every time I dig into it, what I find is that as a human being, I might be carrying around a fear of something. I might be carrying around a fear of the hounds from hell. I might be carrying around a fear that when I die, as punishment for the horrible things I've done, this pack of wild dogs is going to grab a hold of me and tear me to pieces on the way to carrying me down to hell. I could be carrying around a belief like that someone might have said at some point in my life. And I understand that I can subconsciously project that fear into a non-physical reality. And it's a place where thoughts are things. And by projecting that fear into non-physical reality, that pack of dogs can appear out here. And because it's manufactured out of my fear, it can look like this horrible pack of dogs who are going to chase me and rip me to shreds. And if I buy into the fear part and start running, I'd be stuck. I mean, there's a story in the second or third book about that very thing. I'd be stuck in Focus 23 trying to get away from those dogs, which are only my own fear being reflected back to me in an image. I've never found any force that appears to be trying to block that. I have found human beings who, particularly in some of the hells, who have to let go of their ability to experience and express unconditional love to a greater and greater degree so that they can become better at whatever hell they're in. That has a naturally limiting effect. And you might say, well, then those are the demons. Well, I've never found any of those guys or anybody else with enough power that if you encounter such a being and just do something to remember the feeling of love. I don't mean think about it. I mean experience the feeling of it. Like I probably said last year, you know, I was there when my babies were born, and I remember holding them when they were first born. I remember the feelings I was having, and I know that if I just remember that experience, I'll start to feel love. And as I let that feeling build, if I project that feeling towards something I'm afraid of, if it's made out of fear, one of two things will happen. It'll either just evaporate like the mists in sunlight, because love and fear cannot be in the same place at the same time. Or if it's just made a mask over something that's really there, that mask will disappear. But I've come to understand there is nothing that can stand against the power of love. Nothing.
Do you ever ask any questions about where we came from?
Did I ever ask any questions about where we came from?
Yeah, God and the universe.
Yeah.
Where we came from.
Where we came from. How much time do we have? I'll try to give the short version, which is impossible because I talk so much.
Can you incorporate the Sphinx in that too?
At a most basic level, well, not the most basic level, at a level, I would say that the creation of something like an atom could take place like this. Consciousness could decide it would like to be organized as an atom. And it could project a non-physical template of an atom into consciousness. And that as it did that, that template would draw to itself whatever energies were required to fill out the template and end up as an atom, as a physical atom. And that by sort of extrapolating on that process, you can make atoms and molecules and crystals and plants, and in just projecting the pattern of that into reality. But as to how it really got started, Denise and I, again, and one of our partnered explorers, wanted to know about that. We wanted to know, how did all this get started? And so it was really a question of the evolution of consciousness. How did consciousness evolve? Where did all these realities we're visiting come from? How did this get started? Where was this created? In my first book, there's a story about a disc that you could think of as your higher self, or I think of as myself, just in a different perspective. And that I know that right back here, somewhere, there's this thing coming out of my back that you can't see with your physical eyes, that you could think of as a conduit, that information flows back and forth through between Bruce living here in this physical reality in this body, and Bruce living as in a much larger perspective, as something you might describe as your higher self. And that through this, all of my experience is sort of shared with my higher self, a bigger version of me. And that through this, I get some input from there, guidance, if you will. Well, when Denise and I went to explore my disc, trying to figure out, well, you know, how did I get created and how did it get created? And one of us happened to look around behind the disc and realize that there was another one of those things, just like the one here, coming out of the center of the disc in the back, going off that way. And so we followed it to see where it went, and what we found was an even larger disc, an even larger version of me, living in an even much larger perspective, is a way to say it, and that its individual expressions were discs like mine. As I am an individual expression of my disc is an individual expression of it. And we looked around behind that one and saw another one of these things going off, one of these information conduit things. Found an even larger disc, and went around behind and found an even larger one. Me, essentially, but living in a perspective so big I can't even begin to describe what it must be like. And that Denise and I had gone back about 8 generations of these things, of these larger versions of ourselves. And we had our list of questions, and I remember that I sort of floated up and I asked my first question. And the next thing I knew, it was like bliss, pure, sweet, totally accepting, loving cloud started to go through me. And it felt so good, I lost track of everything I was doing, and when it finally passed all the way through, I kind of went, whoa, that felt good. Oh, wait a minute, yeah, I'm here with Denise. Oh, hi, Denise. Oh, yeah, we're here to ask questions. Oh, yeah, the question I asked, and I asked the question again. Same thing happened. This cloud of this sweet, pure, loving acceptance just blissed me out. Totally lost track of what I was doing again. And after it went by, I was just kind of floating around like, wow, and shook my head and thought, oh, wait a minute. Oh, yeah, I'm here. Oh, Denise, there you are. Yeah, we're out here and we're exploring. Yeah, okay. I got the question again. So I asked again. This happened again. I'm thick-headed. It took a while. Until I began to realize that there was some information in that feeling. And that allowed me to begin to sort of carry on a conversation in between being blissed out and trying to figure out what was being said and then remembering your questions. And one of the questions I asked on probably our second trip there was, are you God? Second trip there was, are you God? And the answer I got back was, no, but you're getting close. And then the question I asked was, okay, how do these realities get started? Where does this come from? And whatever this was, me in this huge perspective that, I mean, that doesn't even describe it, said, oh, how did it all get started? Well, yeah. Said, well, Bruce, a long, long time ago, way before there was time, but a long, long time ago, there was this self-aware being, and you could conceptualize it as a big ball of light. It was self-aware. It was conscious. It knew itself. And that this consciousness was floating in the thick, impenetrable blackness of the great unknown. And that things were fine for quite a long time, still before there was time, but things were fine until it began to become curious about what was in that unknown. It wanted to know. And again, before there was time, long before there was time, it began to wonder how it might satisfy its curiosity to know what's in there. And after a while, it hit upon a plan. It would take parts of itself and try to make its own self-aware being. And so parts of itself, kind of launch it off the unknown, and it came apart like 1,000 moths flying every different direction. It didn't stay together. Took parts of itself again and took another part of itself to kind of act like a glue to hold them together. Tried to sidearm one out there and it flew apart. But with nothing better to do and curiosity to satisfy, it continued to experiment, trying to make a self-aware being that it could launch into this unknown in the hopes that it would uncover something about it. And eventually it worked. Eventually it took parts of itself, another part of itself like glue, and it kind of underhanded it and it went, disappeared into the unknown. And it kind of waited. If it had a foot, it would have been tapping it, but it waited for a very long time, way before there was time, but for a very long time it waited for something to happen, and nothing happened. So it went back to experimenting, putting things together. Some survived, some blew up. Until one day, again, long before there were days, till one day, pop back into itself comes one of these things that had launched. And when it popped back in, it brought in awareness of everything it had uncovered in the great unknown. And when it popped back in, that original, that self-aware being knew some of the things that were out there. And it started jumping up and down like a kid with a new toy. This is great. What did I use? And it grabbed that thing and it looked at the number on the back and went back to its lab notebook to see what it had used. How did I make this one? And when it got back in the lab notebook and found the number, it read about what it had done and said, of course, or as my son would say, duh. That's why the thing stayed together. And that's why the other ones didn't stay together, and that's why this one came back. And whatever it was I was talking to or communicating with said, it understood from its notes that it had taken certain traits from itself, and it had used unconditional love as the glue to hold them together. And that was why the other ones flew apart. Because it hadn't used unconditional love before. It had taken parts of itself originally and tried to make this self-aware being. Well, some parts didn't like each other. And when it let go, they just got away from each other. But when it used unconditional love as the glue, all the parts of itself loved every other part of itself. And that held the consciousness together into a self-aware being that survived the launch and survived wandering in the great unknown for who knows how long. And it realized that's why it came back. It came back because it always knew there was a missing part of itself somewhere. And as it flew along through the great unknown and discovering things about what were out there and what's going on in the great unknown, it was always looking for that missing part of itself. It loved itself. And it knew there was a part of itself missing that it wanted to love. And eventually, as it was cruising along, it realized, I think that other part of me is over there somewhere. I can feel something real familiar. And so it sort of accelerated in that direction. Next thing it knew, it popped back in. It rejoined. Well, some of those ones that got launched at some point decided, hey, if it's good enough for that one, it's good enough for me. And some of those took parts of themselves, used unconditional love, because then all the parts of self would love each other and want to stay together, and launched its own probes into the great unknown to satisfy its curiosity about what was there. And some of those decided if it's good enough for them, it's good enough for me, and it did the same thing. It took parts of itself, bonded it together with a glue of unconditional love, and launched them. How did it all get started? That's my story, and I'm sticking to it. Yeah, right. There's nothing I can say that will change your beliefs. But your own direct experience can change your beliefs. And that's probably the only thing that should rightly be able to change your beliefs, your own direct experience. What I teach in my workshops are simple tools anyone can use to begin to explore, to see if we have an afterlife, to have their own direct experience, and then accept that experience as real or not. And as you accept that experience as real, other things happen that begin to allow deeper exploration, if you will, so that you come to your own conclusion. The question is, can you go into the past and future? And in my experience, yes. Can you meet up with Jesus and those kind of folks? In my experience, yes. That you can learn to explore and do that.
Conversations with them.
Pardon?
Have you had conversations with them?
Or with helpers making themselves up to look like them. I couldn't be sure either way. And with that, let's call it a night. I'll stick around out in the lobby for a bit. If any of you brought books along, would like me to sign them, I'd be happy to. And again, thanks to Duncan and